Good morning. I'm Tamala Edwards. Pat Toomey, a Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate seat in Pennsylvania, is our newsmaker. Let's get the inside story. Good morning, and Mr. Toomey is with us here now. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Some good news for you. Out of the Franklin and Marshall poll last week, they found that among registered voters, you were equal to Arlen Specter, ahead of Joe Sestak. Among likely, you really put the burn to both of them, coming out about 10 points ahead of Arlen Specter. Wondering how you look at these numbers. Do you look at it and say they're really coming towards me, or they're moving away from the Democrats, away from Arlen Specter?
Well, I have to tell you, I try not to look at them too closely. You know, we've still got 9 months to go before this election, and I imagine there will be twists and turns and ups and downs, so I don't put too much stock in a poll that's done this early on. But I do think clearly there is a lot of momentum. There's been a lot of support for my campaign. I'm really pleased with the encouragement that I've gotten across the entire state. By any measure, our fundraising, our volunteer organization, the enthusiasm, it's been terrific. So I'm very confident, but I'm taking nothing for granted. I'm going to run like I'm 20 points behind.
Now, that same polling found that 65% of the electorate really didn't know you yet.
Right.
So these days, being on Inside Story, other things are very important.
Right.
What are the main things that you're trying to get voters to remember?
Well, I want to make sure that voters understand that as Pennsylvania Senator, I'm going to be focusing on job growth. My focus is going to be on how we restore prosperity in Pennsylvania and, of course, more broadly. I think you can't get there by bailing out failing companies. I don't think it makes sense for the federal government to nationalize whole industries. I think we're spending way too much money, and the mountain of debt that that's creating is going to actually slow down economic growth and our prospects for prosperity. I think we need some balance in Washington. And so my message is going to be focused on what we need to do to get this economy moving, to create jobs. I think that's what Pennsylvanians want their senator to be focused on, and that's what I'll do.
That's a very economic-based argument. Are you
Right.
going to be talking about social issues very much?
You know, social issues will come up from time to time, certainly, and I don't mind talking about them when they do. That's fine. But I think that the highest priority for most Pennsylvanians right now is, what are we going to do to get this economy moving? How are we going to create jobs? And people have some very serious and understandable economic anxiety for themselves, for their families. I think we all do for our kids and our grandkids. So that'll be my focus.
Now, one values issue, as some people might point it out, was Senator Specter's decision to switch parties. Are you likely to talk about that a lot, and what do you have to say on that?
Well, you know, I was surprised when Senator Specter switched. I mean, he had just spent several months crisscrossing the Commonwealth, insisting that he would never leave the Republican Party because it was so important that there be some checks and balances in Washington, and at the time we had 41 Republicans that provided that check. And then he took one look at a poll that showed he couldn't win the primary, and he just abandoned that and joined the other side. I think that's created a big credibility problem for Senator Specter. That, of course, and his subsequent reversal on policy after policy, as soon as Joe Sestak came into the primary and dragged Senator Specter to the far left, which is where he's been ever since the switch. So, you know, I think Senator Specter's got a serious credibility problem with the voters of Pennsylvania. They'll decide whether in fact they even want him to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. I don't think that's a foregone conclusion.
But he won't waste any time trying to frame the arguments around you. And one that he made when he was here a few weeks ago is he said you were too conservative, pointing out that you have a 97% rating from the American Conservative Union. In fact, just last week you told Politico you cannot win in Pennsylvania unless you broaden your appeal. How do you appeal to moderates?
Well, I would say the same way I appeal to the moderates and the Democrats in the congressional district that I represented. You know, I represented the Lehigh Valley, Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, and the surrounding towns for 3 terms in Congress. That's a district where the Democrats outnumber the Republicans. It's a district where my predecessor in Congress was a Democrat, and the Democratic presidential nominee has won the last 5 presidential elections. I was elected 3 times, never lost a race in that district. And I did it because I was able to reach out to Democrats and independents. So I think my message of economic growth, some fiscal discipline, restoring some balance in Washington, I think that appeals across party lines, and that'll be my message in this race.
One of the other areas that Senator Specter points out is that when you came into the House in the late 80s, you had a lot to do with the deregulation of the financial services industry. And he says, this is the guy you should be mad at when you look at where we are now economically. What do you say about that being part of your background?
That's sad that he would say that. And I say that because there was one big bill that I supported, and so did Arlen Specter. And we both supported the repeal of Glass-Steagall because allowing banks and investment banks to affiliate under a common holding company, which is what that did, and a bill that Bill Clinton signed into law and defends today quite rightly, that had nothing to do with the economic mess we're in now, because it didn't allow banks to do anything that they couldn't do before. And that's not what allowed banks to get into the trouble they got into. Senator Specter should know that. He should know better. And it's a little surprising that he'd be criticizing me for voting for a bill that he voted for himself.
All right, we're down to the last minute or so. Let's have a speed around on a couple of issues. Health care, you don't like what the administration is doing. Quickly, what would you do for all the people out there who don't have health care?
Help with access and lowering costs by giving workers, individuals, the same tax deductibility that employers get. Help consumers have lower costs and more choices by allowing competition across state lines so that Pennsylvania families have hundreds of competing plans to choose from. And lower costs overall by tort reform, which imposes a big cost on health care.
Creating jobs.
Creating jobs, I think instead of borrowing and spending with reckless abandon, we ought to rescind the unspent portion of the stimulus bill, and we ought to look at an across-the-board cut in payroll taxes for workers and the employer's matching share so that every worker gets a take-home pay raise and employers find it less expensive to hire the next worker.
And very quickly, a social issue that's big this week. Don't ask, don't tell. Should the military make a change?
I think ultimately that should be a decision made by the military. You know, this is the most important role of the military. By far and away, the most important thing is our security as a nation. And the ability of our armed services to execute their mission is what really matters. And I think our military leaders understand that best.
All right, Mr. Toomey, I'm sure that we'll be seeing and hearing a lot more from you over the upcoming months. Thank you for being on Inside Story.
Thanks for having me.